Hi, it's Peter Boyles. Welcome to another episode of The Shoot. We started this now almost 2 years ago. Thank you to Mark Crowley. We put this out on our website, and we get some amazing people to talk to us. Now, on The Shoot this morning, Michael DiMino is with us, and I read his bio, and it's extensive through CIA and watching the United States. He's now in a think tank in Washington, D.C. Our share that we have between us is John McCain. Mike, thanks for doing this, and welcome to The Shoot.
Absolutely, Peter. Thank you for having me. It's great to meet you and great to be on with you.
Now, we talked about McCain. Talk about your experiences with McCain and your thoughts about McCain.
Absolutely. It's kind of funny. I was looking to kind of start my career in the political world, and I was a college student at American University in D.C., and I was looking to try to get a job on the Hill, right? And I was very fortunate to see Senator McCain's office looking to hire people, especially people interested in foreign policy and defense, like I was at the time. And I remember going through, probably the most extensive interview process that anybody else had in the Senate at the time. And I was very fortunate to get a job with him, and it was fantastic. And he, led in a way that I think a lot of people can learn lessons from. Most senators and congressmen, if you've spent time on the Hill, maybe they'll have their front office open, or they'll, occasionally they'll do tours or whatever. McCain had every door to every office down the whole Russell Senate hallway that he had open. And he really believed in transparent leadership. And I got an opportunity, as a young kid, to be a fly on the wall in some of these really phenomenal meetings with him and to work with his foreign policy and defense team. And I have a great respect for him. He really helped launch a lot of people's career in politics and especially in foreign policy. And he deserves a lot of credit. I know that, his record to some people, depending on where you sit, what side of the aisle you're on, you have different views on it. But I don't think anybody can argue the fact that he was a great man and a great leader as well.
I had the greatest experiences with him. He had written a book about his father and grandfather. And I read the book, and he came to town. He came into the studio to do the radio show. And we just clicked. And we ended up, he sent one of his aides out for sandwiches, and we sat in the boardroom. And for an hour and a half, Mike, we talked. Then he came back again, and we had a similar experience. He talked about his grandfather, he talked about his father, and he talked about his time as a POW. And one of the more troubling things about Donald Trump, for me, was when Donald Trump said what he said about McCain, and that was way out of line. But I always thought the McCain that I met, and perhaps your experience was the same, and then he was a sailor. And so then he goes out on the stump to run for president. I don't recognize him. I don't recognize that McCain that I spent time with. Somebody softened him up, or somebody said, Senator, don't say those things. But did you get that sense of him as well?
Yeah, it may sound cliche, but I think anybody that spent time around him or around his staff knows that his reputation for for being a maverick was very much deserved. I mean, right? And you know this, Peter. I mean, he would do things sometimes that a lot of us weren't expecting, right? And we're, trying to advise him or whatever. So no, I think he charted his own course. I think, again, regardless of how you may feel about certain issues, and I had, disagreements, with him and with other folks as well over time, but he always was doing, what he thought was the right thing at the time. And I think that independent streak of leadership is important to have in politics, right? To have people that are not beholden to any, bigger group or whatever. And I think he showed that at various times. But yeah, I mean, on policy issues, look, he was very supportive of our intervention in Libya. I was not as supportive of that. But look, I mean, those are the kinds of, substantive disagreements you can have when you have, I think, somebody that cares about their people and cares about, their staff the way that he did.
Sidebar, Bob Dole. after when Bob Dole ran for president, we've talked about this before, he was projected as a stiff. After his presidential run is over, and he's out, he's selling Viagra, you know, he came into the studio and he rolled me. He was so bright and funny and hilarious, and I'm going, where was this guy?
Yeah.
You know, if he'd been on the, I mean, I don't know if you ever around seeing that, but I thought the same thing I thought about McCain, only was in reverse. That the McCain that I met and spent time with, when I saw him on the stump, I'm going, Bob Dole on the stump, okay, comes in the studio, hilarious. So,
right.
You know, I don't know how you bottle that or package it, but it has to do it. Let me quantumly jump you into this pending presidential.
Sure.
What do you see? What's going to happen?
Look, I think, you know, people love to kind of give the cliche, you know, this is the most important election of our lifetimes every 4 years. I think in this case, there really is a lot on the line. And I think that from a foreign policy perspective, which is, again, you know, my, you know, professional expertise and sort of how I'm looking at things, from a foreign policy perspective, I think there's a really interesting choice to be made here. You know, President Biden and the current administration has basically said, you know, we're going to double down in Ukraine, and we are going to potentially double down in the Middle East and all these other places as well. And I think that, you know, President Trump, regardless of how you feel about him, I think is offering some different views on some of these things that frankly, I think do align more with U.S. interests and with the American people as far as where they're at right now. Look, you know, there is no end in sight in Ukraine. I know people feel strongly about that issue, but I don't think this administration has articulated a strategy, Peter, for what the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years are supposed to look like and what American support is supposed to look like. And so I think there are problems there. And I think similarly, if you look at the Middle East right now, regardless of what you feel about President Trump, you know, there were no new wars under his presidency, and how much credit you want to give him for that, you know, is, you know, people feel differently. But look, at the end of the day, I think he's made pretty clear on the campaign trail that at least on the foreign policy issues, he's looking to separate himself from Biden in several meaningful ways that I think will appeal to people. As far as, you know, what we'll see, my goodness, with all these court cases and, you know, the Supreme Court, we're expecting to see something in the next couple of days here, probably on some of the immunity cases. I mean, who knows, right? And I'd be lying to you if I said I had a crystal ball on what we'll see there. But look, I think this is going to be a critical election, and I think for people that look at foreign policy like me, you know, I actually think it's something that speaks to Trump's advantage right now over Biden, and I'd point to the border as well. You know, right? I mean, you've talked about this, Peter, and I know you're watching it closely. We're talking about thousands of people, not just in total, but I think that have credible nexus to terrorist organizations, to potentially foreign sabotage operations. I mean, you know, I dealt with this as a counterterrorism officer at CIA, Peter, and we had these issues, you know, crop up occasionally over the years with, you know, terrorists trying to get in through the southern border. And that issue has only exploded over the last 2 or 3 years. So I think on foreign policy, Trump may have some advantages here that I think he'll probably lean into.
I agree. And let's take them one at a time.
Sure.
How deeply and who got the U.S. so involved in the Ukraine? And I agree with you. If Donald Trump would have been in office, or if Saddam had never been overthrown, which comes back to the Middle East, or the wide open border, it's insanity. And what is in it for me or my family or an American taxpayer to be involved in something that goes back before the time of the Romanovs? So,
right. I mean, it's a good point you raised, Peter. Look, when you challenge people on what core U.S. national interests are at stake in Ukraine, right? Our security, our economic interests, whatever, they can't even really answer the question. And that's why they try to dodge, right? And they talk about things like democracy or kind of these vague notions of, you know, well, we, you know, Europe is at stake. This idea, Peter, that, you know, on one hand, they'll tell you Russia is very weak, and has kind of been exposed as a paper tiger, and the Ukrainians are sort of doing a very good job in stopping them. But then they'll tell you in the next sentence that, and you've heard this from Nikki Haley and other people, that Russia is going to take Poland next, they're going to take Germany, they're going to take the Baltics.
No.
And there's just no evidence for that. And as a career military analyst that has worked these issues with the highest level security clearances you can get, let me just tell you, not speaking anything classified, but let me just tell you, the idea that Russia is going to do any of that is just ridiculous. And so I think when we talk about our men and women in uniform, we have to be putting them in harm's way only when there is a clear mission and a clear U.S. national interest at stake. And I've served with a lot of veterans in the intelligence community. I have worked with a lot of these people. It's horrible, Peter, when you see the scars that many of our boys and girls have had to endure for these wars over the past 20 years with very little to show for it for the United States. And I think that, again, regardless of how you feel about Trump, he has articulated that, I think, in a way that speaks to the American middle class, and it speaks to a lot of blue collar American voters that have seen their brothers and sisters and sons and daughters participate in these conflicts and come away saying, what is the point here? So I think on Ukraine, there isn't really much at stake for the United States. People like to, again, make this domino theory argument that we saw in Vietnam and other eras. We left Indochina back in the 60s and 70s, and did the Soviet Union take over the world? No, they didn't, because we focused our efforts on the correct theater, right? And we focused our efforts where they need to be. So I'd say that China is a much bigger issue than anything going on in Ukraine or the Middle East right now.
Come back, and first of all, I agree with you. My problems with Donald Trump have nothing to do with foreign policy.
Right.
I look at Putin, I look at the Ukraine, this idea that Nikki Haley's selling, which is, as I said, what you pointed out, it's the 50s, it's the dominoes. Well, if Ukraine falls, no. And if I read Putin and if I read history correctly, this is kind of the Cuban Missile Crisis in advance, or in reverse. Jack Kennedy did not want those missiles in Cuba. Vladimir Putin does not want NATO in Ukraine. And as I said, if you read Russian history, not Soviet history, but Russian history, they've been at each other's throats, as I said, prior to the Romanovs.
Yeah.
And when you read, when Barbarossa happens and the Nazis are welcomed into Ukraine, and there's a civil war that continues probably until 1948 inside of Ukraine as Stalin's army comes back across. So that conflict has been there. But my real question is, I've now dubbed it the war machine, the military-industrial complex. Mike, who's making the money?
Well, look, I think a lot of our defense contractors, right, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, all these multi-billion-dollar companies certainly have an interest in continuing to feed a need to DoD. But look, I think it's also a lot of our elites and a lot of our politicians that, frankly, whether they're beholden to foreign corporations or they're compromised by foreign countries, this is an issue, and it's something that I've talked about and written about in my scholarship, Peter. We need to completely rewrite the Foreign Agents Registration Act, and we need to get a lot more people and a lot more institutions that are taking dark money from all sorts of foreign countries, and we need to get them registered, and we need to make sure that people know where money is going in politics. I don't think we're ever going to get money out of politics, sadly, but I think we can do a better job knowing where it's going and knowing who is benefiting from these things. But yeah, I would say that sadly, a lot of our elites are captured by some of these foreign interests, whether they're the Gulf states or any number of actors. They all play a role in that, and I think that is one weak spot for our democracy. Is we love open society. We want to have an open society, but if you've ever been down to the Capitol building on an average Tuesday or Wednesday, I mean, you'll see hundreds of different special interest groups waiting for their meeting with their representative or their senator, and I had a front row seat to this working on the Hill and at the Defense Department as well. And look, I think it's something that we have to crack down on.
When a Bradley fighting vehicle arrives in the Ukraine, who pays for it?
Well, this is kind of a complicated question that gets into, the presidential drawdown authorities. It gets into sort of the various mechanisms that exist to give aid to Ukraine right now. The main mechanism is called the USAI, the U.S. Security Assistance Initiative for Ukraine. I guess to try to keep it simple, I'll say, at the end of the day, the United States is footing the bill, and U.S. taxpayers are footing the bill for all this. Right.
Yeah,
And people will try to give you creative arguments. Something that I think has been popular over the last few weeks is to say, well, a lot of this money is getting reinvested in, in the United States. And that's just a ridiculous kind of obfuscation of the issue. Yeah.
Some of it is U-turn money. It comes back to Raytheon. It comes back to the people you're talking about. But by and large, the American taxpayer is supporting that. And that's not lost on Putin, is it?
No, I don't think so. And look, for whatever people want to say about Putin, and people remember at the beginning of the war, he has cancer, he's insane, he's mentally ill, whatever. All that is garbage. He is a rational actor. Russia is a great power, whether people want to admit that or not. They think that that's some kind of endorsement. But if you just study international relations, you're talking about one of the largest countries in the world with 6,000 nuclear weapons, one of the largest militaries conventionally in the world. They're a great power and they're not going anywhere. And it's funny, people say, well, what does Putin really want in Ukraine? I'll call people to the day after the invasion of Ukraine back in 2022. Putin gave a 75-minute speech where he talked at length about what his arguments are. And again, you don't have to disagree with those arguments, right? People don't have to agree with them or whatever. But at the end of the day, he's laid out a rationale. He laid it out to Tucker Carlson, the other week in their interview. And look, I think Russia has been very clear that it's not going to tolerate NATO in Ukraine. And that's been the case going back several decades now. If you look at, different agreements and different, whether you're looking at the Baker memo or, the Minsk agreements that were supposed to wrap all this up a couple of years ago as well. Look, there have been efforts to, the U.S. policy community largely acknowledged that, Peter. But what I think is so interesting is after the invasion occurred, nobody in D.C. wants to acknowledge that anything to do regarding with NATO expansion could have played a role in the war. And again, for people that cover these issues professionally, it's just obvious that it played a role, whether people like to admit it or not.
It's Jack Kennedy and Cuban and Khrushchev's
good analogy. Yeah.
Take them out of here. And of course, as we know from reading, Khrushchev does and Jack relinquishes. And, I don't know who the winner really is because it costs both of them. But the point of it was, you can't have these missiles, 12 minutes or 15 minutes from Miami. You just can't do it. I can't say I'm a fan of Vladimir Putin, but you can read him, and he's telling you what he's going to do. How does that end? Or is there an ending? Because I'm going to move you to Middle East, but how does that end in Ukraine? And if the U.S. were to pull away, then how would it end?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things here, Peter. How is it going to end? It's going to end how most modern wars end these days, which is with a negotiated settlement. The idea that Ukraine or Russia are going to achieve some kind of total victory is just nonsense. It's just fantasy. So there's going to be a negotiated settlement here. The question is, do we want to try to urge Ukraine to do that while it may be in an advantageous position to do that? Or do we want to do it after it's too late and we may miss the window for that? And that's my concern, Peter, again, as somebody that, I'm no fan of Vladimir Putin either. John McCain was no fan of Vladimir Putin. But at the end of the day here, we want to see a sovereign and independent Ukraine. And the best way to do that is actually to get them to the negotiating table now before more of these potential Russian breakthroughs on the front line occur, which we've seen in Avdiivka. We've seen them in a couple other places in recent days where there seems to be some growing Russian momentum. Now, again, I don't think Russia is going to, make it all the way to Kyiv overnight or anything like that. But I think, Ukraine has to consider the reality of their position here. And that's really, I think, how this is going to end. And I don't think that, to your second question, U.S. aid is really the decisive factor at the moment. Again, if you're a military analyst, a military historian like I am, and you study these things, Ukraine's issue right now, Peter, is manpower. It's not it's not fancy weapon systems. It's not F-16s. It's not ATACMs. It's manpower. They are running out of people to maintain their forward line of troops. And they don't really have anywhere else to get that manpower, which is why you've seen some speculation over the past couple of days that, Emmanuel Macron came out with this ridiculous statement that, maybe we're going to send NATO troops, and you had other NATO countries shoot that down, rightfully so, I would add. But look, I think it speaks to the truth that Macron is kind of getting at, which is, look, I think everyone is recognizing in Western capitals right now that Ukraine is out of people. And so we can get to the negotiating table while there is still a sovereign and independent Ukraine, or we could wait too long and risk Russia potentially taking more or all of the country.
One of my favorite historians is Barbara Tuchman, and she is lengthy about something called the Tripwire War. And she describes the First World War as a tripwire. And I put the Middle East under this umbrella. Keep screwing around, and somebody's going to step on the wrong wire. And now it's in the jackpot. And I watch all this American aid going there, and I often, daily, think to myself, what is the war aim? What is the aim of this war vis-a-vis, or in why my country is involved in their war? Michael, what do you come away with?
Yeah, look, I think if we're, again, really putting American interests first and we're putting the American people first, there aren't any U.S. interests at stake in most of the Middle East, and we can draw down most of our presence there without too much changing. And look, I think the people that try to tell you that, Iran is somehow going to take over the Middle East or something, I think it's fear-mongering, and I think it's pablum, and it's not supported by the facts. Look, our presence in Iraq and Syria, really quick, for example, our boys and girls out there are just getting attacked daily. I mean, it's been 170 something plus attacks, and those attacks have paused of late. But again, you have to ask yourself, as someone that's been in the region and been to many of these places, these are tiny little outposts with sandbags and concertina wire, and we just don't need to maintain this presence anymore. And for people that care about ISIS or counterterrorism, I was personally involved in the counterterrorism fight with ISIS. Look, we can handle a lot of that with what we call over-the-horizon capabilities, right? We don't need to maintain a physical presence on the ground in a lot of these places to keep a lid on ISIS and even to counter Iran if you want to. So, look, I think what's going on in the Middle East right now is a classic example of what we call horizontal escalation, where you start to see the conflict spread to Lebanon, to Iraq, to Yemen, right, with the Houthis. And none of this is good for the United States. And I think that the Biden administration has really failed in putting its foot down and saying, look, this has to de-escalate, and we have to bring about a cessation of hostilities here, in the region. And look, the United States in past Arab-Israeli conflicts has stayed out of it and has pursued de-escalation. And I think that that's really the most responsible thing to do here. President Trump did it as well. When we had various, cycles of escalation with Iran, I think President Trump recognized that there wasn't a lot on the line for the United States of value in fighting some big war with Iran. So I would encourage this administration to kind of arrive at a similar conclusion that, look, with intelligence capabilities, with our diplomatic capabilities, with our economic capabilities, there are other ways to solve these problems.
I could not agree more. I have this running theory that if Saddam Hussein were alive today and had nothing to do with 9/11, I don't know if much or if any of this would be going on. He was always the check dog on the mullahs. If Saddam were here, would much of this be going on, Mike?
It's a great point, Peter. It's something I've written about and tweeted about as well. So it's funny to hear you say that, because I think we're perfectly on the same page there. If people want to talk about Iran's malign influence in the region, let's talk about where it started. It started with the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, and what you point out is absolutely true, that Saddam was the regional counterbalance to Iran. Iraq at the time had the third largest military in the world. They had fought a nasty war with the Iranians in the late 1980s in the Iran-Iraq War. Very bloody conflict where Iraq basically signaled, they didn't perform exceptionally well in that conflict, but they signaled to Iran, look, we're willing to go to the mat over,
Yeah.
a balance of power here in the Middle East. And so I think, it's funny, people like to argue, well, Saddam was a bad guy and he was a dictator and whatever. Look, we work with the Saudis, we work with
Oh,
countries all over the world, right?
oh,
That
oh.
that I think you could argue. So, so the idea that, he wasn't some perfect guy. No one's defending his, moral, whatever. But at the end of the day, we have to be thinking about our foreign policy in terms of national interest, not in terms of what makes us feel warm and fuzzy inside. And I think, if Saddam were around today, he would actually be a huge bulwark against Iranian influence, and the power vacuum that led to the rise of ISIS and then the rise of these Shia militia groups is all kind of ties back to that, to the beginning of the invasion.
I've often said that ISIS is George Bush's Frankenstein. That like I said, I'm absolutely no fan of Saddam, but if you read the history of just the oil multinationals in the Middle East, some of the most despotic human beings sucking air. The multinationals have they don't even blink and they do business with them. So, no, I mean, your point's well taken again. Now, Israelis, Palestinians, is there a way out of this?
Look, this is the $1 million question right now. This is the big foreign policy issue of the moment, of course, ever since October 7th, which was horrible. But look, again, if we're talking about American interests here, the best thing we can do is bring this conflict to an end as quickly as we can. And that's been the perspective, by the way, and this, having read the history, Peter, of every American president, whether you look back at 73 or 56 or 48, Republicans, Democrats, the United States doesn't benefit in any way when this kind of turmoil is going on in the Middle East. So the best thing we can do is try to wrap it up as quickly as we can. And look, this gets to a bigger conversation about, U.S. influence and how much the U.S. wants to push Bibi Netanyahu or doesn't want to do it, and sort of what are the consequences of that. And may we see a new Israeli government formed, in the aftermath of this crisis. I think a lot of people feel that it's very unlikely that Netanyahu, sticks around, after this. Folks that I talk to in Israeli politics think that is the case. We'll see. But I think the best thing the U.S. can do now is try to wrap this up quickly to avoid any kind of blowback on the United States and to avoid any kind of exposure, right, for our troops in Iraq and Syria or our sailors in the Red Sea or other places. So I think that has to be the priority here.
Can Israelis win? I read Netanyahu and I listen to some talk radio and until the last man is dead kind of thing. Well, history is on our side that says they don't end.
Right.
The line might have been Toynbee's great line. There are places in the world where there is no tomorrow. It is simply yesterday repeating itself. The Palestinians, the Israelis, and now, as you pointed out, now it's in Lebanon, now it's in Syria, and that's more scary than I think people under, or even that American ships are now under attack.
Right. And look, why? This is the point, Peter, is no one is stopping to ask what is at stake for the United States right now. It's really just we are sort of reflexively reaching for that familiar tool of military force, and we're not really asking ourselves, is this the right tool for the job, and what are we hoping to gain out of this strategically? What is the end game? I think your point is very well taken on, look, if you're a student of the Middle East, this is just sort of time is a flat circle, right? We just kind of keep going around in this. And I think that also is a reason why the United States should not be so obsessed with trying to dominate the Middle East. It's a historical, sort of a problem to try to be a dominant regional hegemon in this part of the world. And I think we have to be focusing on other parts of the world, like the Indo-Pacific, or right here at home with our southern border, where our interests are much more impacted by what is happening there. So, I don't think that these ancient grievances between Muslims and Jews, or between Israel and Iran, or these other conflicts, I don't think they're going to go away. I think the issue is just, let's try to de-escalate, and let's try to make sure that America's involvement when these issues flare up is to try to de-escalate and to try to resolve the issue as best that we can. But again, no one is asking strategic questions at the White House right now. And I have a lot of colleagues and friends that are still in government, and they tell me that as well. Look, there's just not a lot of strategic thinking going on about what the end game is here and what we're hoping to do. And look, the Israelis, they may, defeat Hamas, but I don't think that they're going to get rid of the Palestinian grievances that are underlying all that. And I think that what we're going to see, Peter, is probably just the rise of a Hamas 2.0 out of this. Sure. So I think, again, you have to ask yourself, what are we trying to achieve here? And I don't think that the U.S. government or the Israelis have been very clear on how this looks post conflict with the sort of offensive operations ending. Okay, who's going to run the place? Are you going to have an Arab coalition? Or are you going to have, you're going to try to have, totally discredited Palestinian Authority guys try to come in and run it, right? I mean, that's the consequence of undermining the PA and other groups like that over the past several decades. Is now when you're looking for a more moderate voice, you're not able to really find it.
Remember the search for the good German.
Right.
We're looking for the good German. And one of George Bush's many mistakes that are legion, he declared that if you had been a Ba'athist, then you couldn't work back in the water company. And the Americans, and they would find the so-called good German.
Right.
Put them right back to work.
And many of those guys, Peter, that were kicked out of the Iraqi government and they were stripped of their pensions and of their jobs, engineers, doctors, during the de-Baathification process in Iraq, guess where a lot of those guys ended up a couple of years later? They ended up in ISIS. So
absolutely.
This is a good example.
I have traveled in the Middle East and I've met guys that tell you those stories that, that was I think the worst administration, the worst foreign policy decisions, perhaps of.
I agree.
It's tough to top Lyndon Johnson or Richard Nixon, but boy, that's right in there. A final question, and I'm with you on what you're saying about U.S. foreign policy. I have no idea. Is this the old Cold War warriors, the old establishment calling the shots? Because they sure as hell, it's everything that they do the opposite, and you may have had a chance. Final comments, and we'll get you on our radio side too. You've been a wonderful guest. Michael, your final thoughts.
Thank you, Peter. Yeah, I'm happy to come back on anytime. Look, just to close out, I'll say this old sort of Cold Warrior ethos is still very much running our foreign policy, and something that we're trying to do at Defense Priorities is build a coalition of conservatives, of libertarians, of all sorts of folks that are willing to say, hey, this is not what's best for the United States, and let's take our foreign policy in a different direction.
Why am I responsible? I mean, it's been the world's cop argument since after the Second World War. I mean, how and why? And it's every one of these loses, and every one of them is expensive, not only in human life, but the amount of money that's spent. It's sad. You're wonderful. You're terrific. You're a great guest, and it's way past a half an hour flew by. Mike, we will be together again, I promise you. And thanks for doing the shoot. It was a great guest. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Peter.
All right, everybody. Down the hall Saturday morning. See you on the radio at 9 a.m. Mark Crowley, Kelly Michaels, thank you. Take care, everybody. See you the next time on the shoot. By the way, the next time, Billy Thorpe and Jeff Hunt will come in. They'll sit down. We'll talk about mornings on 710 KNUS. I'll see you then.